Hey, Detoxers. Today I am joined by Mark Blyth, the Williams R. Road 57 Professor of International Economics and Professor of International and Public Affairs and the Director of the Rhodes Center at Brown University. Also, someone I'm a big fan of, used his work a lot of my own. Mark Blyth, welcome to the Disinfo Detox.
It is great to be with you.
Absolutely. And, obviously, on this program, we deal with a lot of problematic narratives in news media. And I want to reach out to you because I think one of your many talents is you're able to take some of these complex economic ideas and make those of us not in the economic space feel like we understand it. And to start, I wonder, I've heard you use this analogy before about kind of the different phases of capitalism in the United States, and use this analogy about how they're kind of like a laptop with different software and there's
Yeah.
bugs in the system. And can you kind of explain those three areas of capitalism as we kick off
All
here?
right. So let's try and do this so I don't sort of like lose people and bore them to death by going on too long, right? So here's the basic idea behind this, right? Any economy has what we could call hardware. Everybody's got a capital market to raise money. Everybody's got a labor market to find labor. Everybody's got a product market to sell stuff. But they're different, right? The Swedish labor market is totally different from the American labor market, even though they've both got one. So let's think about that as hardware. Let's think about software. What software? How we should put all this together and make it work, right? The governing ideas of a particular era. So if you think in those terms, you can basically map kind of 40 to 50-year periods across American and indeed global history. So you could have this gold standard era whereby everything's open, capital flows, labor flows, money flows across the world, Ellis Island, immigration, the whole 9 yards to the United States. Very, very flexible, open markets, and the whole thing's backed by gold. What does that mean? It means that ultimately countries want to have gold rather than let gold go. That means they'd rather be exporters rather than importers. That means that ultimately there's too much stuff trying to be sold in the world economy. That creates deflation. That reduces wages. That creates a lot of strife. And you end up with the Second International Socialism, World War One, and the aftermath thereof. So let's think about the one that we built after World War Two. If the problem was deflation, you're trying to solve that. What do? You set up the hardware such that you have much less international integration. You have smaller national economies that, rather than sort of being run for the basis of profit, are to a certain extent run for full employment because it was thought that unemployment was the big problem you needed to solve. And you do that by arranging the hardware in a certain way. What you do is you really limit your financial flows in your financial markets. You boost unions, you boost big employers. You try and create a kind of political economy that the Europeans called corporatism, where each has their own defined space and legal representation. You bargain over wages and so on and so forth. That was kind of the golden age model. And, what were the governing ideas? That basically the ideas from the 20s and 30s were wrong, and we needed to focus on reflationary kind of Keynesian macroeconomics, raising demand to keep that full employment target. What was the bug in the software that came along? This time it wasn't too many exporters. This time it was inflation. And once inflation got out the bottle, ultimately you kill profits, and business turns around and goes, we don't like this anymore. And they basically invented Reagan and Thatcher and the whole neoliberal revolution to bring profit back, which brings us to phase three. So what was that? Integrate, privatize, globalize, make capital mobile, push down on unions, restore the capital share. Everything that we've done in the past 30, 40 years, finance is king, central banks are independent of government, etc., etc. All work to restore the value of profit. What was the bug in the software this time? Various forms of inequality and financial fragility, all of which came home in 2008. It's been running basically on fumes and central bank liquidity since then. There's been a couple of attempts to restart it. Trump won, Biden with the IRA, and now we're at the end of this, which is kind of a, yeah, maybe we're moving out of this one at something else moment.
That's what I wanted to ask in the next question here. So, do you consider us in a post neoliberal moment? And if so, yeah, how would you describe the current approach to the economy?
So it's kind of funny. So domestically, no, if you mean by that, hey, are unions back and people have really high wages? No, clearly that's bullshit. But internationally, yeah, because if you think about it, even though capital's still much more mobile than it was and so on and so forth, we haven't had a big trade agreement since 2000 and whenever. The last one failed in 2004. There were various attempts to do ones in the 1990s. They fell apart. We've had Brexit. right? That's been a big one in terms of that. We've had Trump's tariffs. Trump's tariffs being kept up by Biden for reindustrialization. And now Trump's full-throated attempt to basically pull America very much out of the global economy and make people pay for market access in the global economy. So, yeah, I think it's very different on the international level. And you're beginning to see it change on the domestic level as well, although that's much more inchoate and sort of variegated.
Okay, and so when it speaking of the tariffs, obviously it's something I want to get into. I want to, first, I guess, be a little bit fair. Is there any? Can you articulate, I guess, what kind of Trump's economic vision is with these tariffs in the most fair sense before we kind of get to the critiques of it?
Yeah, I mean, you have to think about the sort of the different factions that are around Trump. I mean, you got people like Navarro who are just like tariff hawks, right? And you have to start from a premise, as the president does, that sometimes goes, they're ripping us off, right? Well, come on, nobody's forcing you to buy the BMW. You're buying the BMW because the alternative's crap. That's why you want the import, right? So nobody's forcing it in these transactions. But the bigger story here is the following, and this is the one that's kind of generally accepted, and I think the Biden people accepted a version of this as well. The problem is we issue the dollar, and the dollar's great for the world because it provides liquidity and transaction stability for everybody. If you're in Pakistan and you want to buy oil, or let's say gas from Doha, they don't want paid in your weak currency that's going to fluctuate all over the place. They want you to pay in dollars, right? There are more dollars made outside the United States in the so-called euro markets based in London, dollar lending, than is actually made in the United States by the Fed and the Treasury. So the dollar's a global currency. Now, what does that mean? It means that because everybody wants to hold dollars, you can print an unlimited amount of them. And we do in the form of treasuries, and there's never been a failed treasury auction. And what that means is that we get to import whatever we want, what almost setting the price for it. In exchange for that, we give you a digital certificate called the treasury bearing 2% or 3%. And we've been doing this for years. It's the best deal ever. This is why Walmart exists, right? Problem is this: in 1975, biggest employers in the country were, I think if I remember correctly, Exxon and General Motors and that sort of stuff. Biggest employers in the country now are, let's see, Walmart, Home Depot, and I think Amazon Logistics. We stop making stuff. We start shipping stuff in from somewhere else. And that's a problem, as we found out in the pandemic. It has also deeply scarred parts of the country, this deindustrialization in the Midwest and the Southeast in particular. And what you've got now is a bunch of the core of the Republican states, if you think from Alaska through North Dakota down to Texas, around the Panhandle and up to West Virginia, whose local economies are very much based upon carbon assets. Think fuels, farm, fertilizer, food, feedstock, right? This sort of stuff. And when they see Biden's green agenda, they're like, whoa, hold on a second, because that means our assets are going to go to zero and we're going to be the next Midwest, and we'd rather not have that happen, right? So if you kind of put all that together, what you've got is a kind of desire to overcome and reindustrialize. Part of that is sort of the payoff to the MAGA base that were the ones that faced the brunt of those costs, if you will. And the one thing they can all agree on is essentially you do this behind tariffs because it's not about the revenue, although that helps in some ways, and we can talk about it. What it's really about is forcing European car manufacturers to make more in the United States. So if you look at today, the final agreement on tariffs, right? These guys are facing really high cut tariffs. When you look at European labor costs and European power costs, and you want to ship that BMW now, makes way more sense to make it in Spartanburg. So that's what this is really about. If there is a core of it, that's what makes sense to me. Now, is there sort of loads of other stuff going on that you go, well, what about this and what about this? Yeah, it's a bit of a sort of kaleidoscope meets like the tumble dryer, but I think that's the core of what's going on.
And so from a economics perspective here, what are the kind of the warning signs about this approach to the economy that Trump is engaging in?
Well, from my point of view, and I'm just speaking personally on this one, you got a couple of problems. The first one is when you haven't made anything for 20 years, you don't have the skills to make it. And if you did have the skills, they'd be 20 years out of date. So what you got with Biden's IRA was an attempt at kind of like joined up industrial policy. Yes, you give the subsidies for the firms to come in and make stuff, but then you suddenly realize you don't have the skills. So then you have to make labor skilled, and that means retraining people. That means really investing in everything from technical colleges to universities, instead of which we've got a fatwa in the university system. So that's not too helpful, right? What else? Basically, we don't have enough kids. right? At the end of the day, my generation and your generation haven't had enough kids. And if you think an economy is really nothing more than the number of people, number of hours worked, and the quality and quantity of capital that they've got, then if the number for people goes down, either you work more hours or you shove in more robots. Now, the easy one to do is, well, you bring more people in, and that's called immigration. But this government decided it doesn't like immigration. It wants to tighten labor markets by getting women out of the labor market to have more kids, which is weird because they need a time machine, because they need to go back in time and have the kids to have any effect now. It's not going to help 30 years from now, right? But bracketing that one, you get rid of all the immigrants, and then basically the white working class can work in factories again, except that they don't have the skills, and factories are filled with robots. So I don't actually see this one working, even if I understand the motivation behind it.
And another part of that too, right, is that even those what we often refer to as good jobs, those jobs that folks were able to get back in, say, the 60s, 70s, walk out of high school and get a 30-year
Yeah,
career with a pension. So I think he's selling the return of these manufacturing jobs as if they're going to come with all of those labor
right.
benefits. But can you talk a little bit about that? Why that's also kind of selling a facade?
Well, I mean, you could regulate it, you could do that sort of stuff. But, to me, the problem is ultimately the vision of sort of like loads of guys like you sitting at a bench making stuff is itself 50 years out of date, right? That's not what modern factories look like. I mean, I was talking to a guy who manufactures in the United States, and he says, if we post an office job for 25 an hour, we'll get 100 applicants, right? Not a problem. We have to go up to 50 before we get people to actually work in the factory. Why? Because it's hot, because it's quite dangerous, because it's unpleasant, and you really have to pay people to do it. So they already can't find enough people, and they're paying $50 to try and get people in there. So, I think that sort of you kind of just assume the supply side of skills and talent, and then this makes sense. But the minute you complicate that, it really doesn't.
Okay, I want to shift gears and talk about politics as well, which I know that's one of the things I always find fascinating about your work, this intersection of politics and economics. And talk a little bit about kind of the Democratic Party and where they are in soul searching as we go through this sort of transitional economy and they come out of this electoral beating in 2024. What do you kind of make of what you're seeing and hearing from the Democrats in terms of where they're going as a party to
I mean,
to create an identity?
honestly, Nolan, your guess is as good as mine. They don't talk to me. I mean, it's as simple as that, right? I don't really have my fingers on the pulse on this one. I mean, I've actually taken to calling them the party that shops at Whole Foods. Right, I mean, because if you want, I just did this book on inflation, right? You can get it from Norton. It's called "Inflation: A Guide for Users and Losers," and it's written for everybody, right? And one way to think about sort of the effects of inflation is to divide everybody along the income distribution from poorest to the richest, right? And put them in 20 percentiles, bottom 20, next 20, whatever, right? And if you're in the bottom 60, you've been facing wage stagnation and rising costs for the past 20 years, and you don't think things are going well. And when a 10% inflation, well, even 5% inflation comes along, you're in the bottom 20%, that really hurts, right? Now, if you're in the top 20% or even the top 10%, the professional managerial classes, as Bannon likes to call them, right? And you shop at Whole Foods, you literally don't care about inflation because you've been paying a third more for your groceries than you should have for the past 10 years anyway, simply by showing up at Whole Foods. So you spend much less of your income on consumption. So you can afford to take the hit, right? And this is kind of what the Democrats have become. They've basically become urban. They've become more female than male. They've become above median income. And most of their donor base is top 20% or above. And they are the people that shop at Whole Foods. Now, I don't know how you win an election with the people who shop at Whole Foods. And you can try and bolt together all these coalitions of everything based upon identity politics and sexuality and so on and so forth. But that all seems to fracture and blow up in your face. It's highly volatile. It's not stable. So having lost, if you will, the indigenous white working class almost completely, I think it's very hard for them to come back at this point in time. Second thing is they don't know who they want to be when they grow up. again, sort of referring to Steve Bannon, and I never thought I'd do that twice in an interview. But one of the things that he says is that until the Democrats embrace a left populist economics, they'll never win anyone back. And I totally agree. Now, where do you get that? You get this with AOC, you get it with Bernie, you get it with the guy who's going to be the next mayor in New York, who everyone thinks is apparently the reincarnation of Leon Trotsky, because he dared to say, is it possible for us to have 4 grocery stores that aren't run by Jeff Bezos and cost a fortune? So that makes you a communist these days. So that's a bit nuts, right? But anyway, they've got that agenda. But take that agenda on its own. I can imagine you could pull maybe 20%, 30% of MAGA voters away from that. Absolutely. But then you're going to lose your Whole Foods. Then you're going to lose your donor class, right? So I do not know how they square this. I think they're dead in the water and they don't know how to restart the engine.
Okay, and shifting gears, the other major party here, the Republican Party. I've seen a lot of discussions about kind of the post-Trump era. As you look at this coalition, I mean, is this a coalition that someone besides Trump can hold together in your estimation?
No, I think this is entirely about Trump. And this is what people have completely misunderstood and to use that Bushism I love, misunderestimate, um, for the past decade, right? Is it's about him. Go to a rally, right? Listen to that 2 hours of this guy riffing. And he's incredible. He forges a connection with his audience. He manages to talk to everyone at a level that they truly understand and appreciate. They don't sound like someone who's manufactured, who's coming in and like doing this sort of stuff. So it's about the fact that he's done that like hundreds of times and built this coalition. Now, of course, other support functions around this. Yes, the entire sort of like right wing econosphere and sort of think tank sphere is now glommed onto this, and you've got Agenda 25 and all that sort of goods, Project 2025, etc. All that sort of architecture around it. But you take him out of it, right? What have you got? You've got Vance not really seeing it, right? I mean,
Mhm.
basically, presidents take on vice presidents as assassination insurance, and vice presidents take on the job of vice president on a 50-50 bet that the old guy might die and I might get the job. But that's what the analogy for me would be Gerald Ford,
Mm.
right? It would be like Nixon blows out, and if anything happened to Trump, he would be the guy that would step in. Could he take over and win on its own? I mean, people really underestimated Harry Truman versus Roosevelt, but Truman was truly a gifted politician. He knew the Senate, he knew how things worked, he knew how to get people to do things, and it was a very different era, far less media driven. So, again, if there's a fragility on the Republican side, their strength is the fact that the Democrats don't know what to do and who they are. The fragility is it's all about Trump. So if he ever like doesn't hold the mantle down, I think this thing just disintegrates.
Okay, and I think regardless of where people sit on the aisle, there's a lot of people out there who are worried, obviously, about the future of democracy, but also the future of the economy. As you watch some of these changes, for folks out there who maybe aren't steeped in the literature, don't follow this stuff day to day, what are some things you recommend that folks pay attention to, economically speaking, as we go forward in Trump 2.0?
So, I mean, couple of some. I mean, all of these things are slightly technical. They're not on everybody's day-to-day radar, right? One is like 40-50% of the stock market, which the vast majority of people are not invested in. But if it tanks, it has consequences for everybody else, right? Is invested in AI and invested in buying stuff from other firms that are heavily investing in AI. And if you strip out that capital expenditure, there's not a lot going on. Labor market doesn't look good. And even though you're tightening it by enforcing immigration, etc., all of which is negative on the sort of, let's say, human rights and democracy ledger, it's not that great. And if this thing goes bang, then there's going to be repercussions. Second thing is sort of the wider financial system. So a couple of things to think about. When Trump did his tariffs on April 2nd, what he did was there was a big sort of like in the treasury market, and it's since sort of mean reverted and came back. But what he kind of did was to say to people, usually you think of treasuries as the savings bond for the world. So it doesn't matter what the news flow is. The treasury is the treasury. It works its own dynamics. And he kind of came out and said, that's not true anymore. We're willing to basically do policies that will directly affect the value of treasuries in the future. And we've got Stephen Murren, who's written that Mar-a-Lago thing about how we're going to have this big debt exchange and you're all going to give us more money for basically nothing. And there's a lot of uncertainties being generated, right? Next thing that comes along there is the crypto thing. So you got the crypto thing. What's the crypto thing? Stable coins. So I don't know if I need a stable coin, and I study this stuff, but apparently we do. What it does is create a kind of captive market for treasuries up to about 4 to 5 trillion over the next few years. That relieves the pressure on government bonds because you get a buyer that has to buy it, right? If they want to play the stable coin game. But ultimately, what that's doing is just, again, issuing more debt, and also issuing more debt to a bunch of very volatile, fragile things, right? So that's not so great. Under the radar last week, an executive order giving fund managers access to private equity alternative investments, on the grounds that the double speak here is brilliant. We're democratizing finance by giving you, the peasant, access to the stuff that rich people buy and trade. Now, why would you do that? Answer: because the whole of that private equity sector hasn't really made any money in the past 10 years. They're all massively overinvested in a bunch of firms they're never going to bring to market and sell. They've been swapping bits of paper with each other called private credit to keep the whole thing going. And what you're actually watching is a bailout before the crisis, right? Give us the money in the 401ks to make us trade our way out of this. Otherwise, we're smushed, right? So you put all that together and you got a financial crisis. Let's say something happens. Usually what happens to resolve a financial crisis is that the cost of government debt goes negative in a crisis. Here's how this happens. Here's equity. Here's public debt, private equity, right? Not, well, equities, right? So I've got lots of stocks and shares. Oh my God, the market's falling. Right? So what I want instead, I want these things. So prices and yields, their interest payments, are moving opposite directions on bonds. So the more that people want them, the more the price goes up, the more the interest rate goes down. In a crisis, so many equities hit the market at once, the cost of this stuff goes negative. The private sector is paying the government to give them a bond as a safety asset. But what if they no longer believe it's safe? We've never been there before, and that's the one that worries me.
Wow. Let me, as we close up, let me ask you one other thing. You brought it up there. I was going to bring up crypto. You mentioned that, but I want to bring up AI because I've listened to you talk about this over the years. And so I saw a study recently, upwards about 70% of people are concerned AI is coming for their job. What's your take on that? Are these concerns well founded, or how should we think about
I,
this so-called
I'm
AI
just look,
revolution?
maybe it's because I'm just old, right? Just saying, old fart doesn't get tech, right? I'll literally wear the t-shirt, right? I use LLMs. I've published an academic paper using LLMs. I know what these things are. They're pretty damn useful. They'd be pretty good. In higher education, they're a disaster because they're basically a plagiarism generator. But park that for a minute, right? Are these transformative technologies? Maybe. I mean, electricity was a transformative technology. It took us 30 years to wire every building. Um, are you going to be able to fire everybody and replace them with AIs? Well, if so, who's going to buy shit? Because AIs don't consume things. So that would seem pretty weird. More importantly, 15 years ago, we called this thing big data and machine learning. And what machine learning did was to look at unstructured data and find patterns. Then there was this whole research that was kind of parallel or adjacent to this on neural nets. And that became the basis of large language models, which are basically algorithms that predict the next thing that comes along. So if this, what's the probability of this? What's the conjoint probability of that given this under the conditions, right? And you just map it out, right? So one of them takes unstructured data, finds a pattern, and the other one basically says, given the pattern, what can I generate? And if you stick a neural net on the end of that, you get talking Google, right? That's it, whole thing, right? That's all it is, right? Now, if that's the case, is this going to change the world? Well, back in 2020, there was a book called The Race Against the Machine by a couple of guys at Harvard. And they said that, if I remember right now, 60% of all jobs would be automated by 2020. Ooh. And then Oxford Man Institute, I think it was. No, it wasn't Oxford Man. It was somebody else, Oxford, 2016, came along and said, 40%. And then for 2020. And then in 2016, the OECD came along and 20%. And we got to 2020, and the answer was zip. Right. So this is called a hype bubble. Now, sometimes these things can actually be kind of beneficial in the long run. I'll give you an example. It's back in 1999 when people were buying Kramer.com. When the whole thing went caboodle, what was left was loads of fiber optic cable that people had laid down without the processing power to actually use it efficiently. 10 years later, Netflix showed up with the servers. So if you have a technological bust, yes, there's a lot of damage done short term. These firms go under, etc. But if they leave real things behind, that's great, right? there was no bust in machine learning. It just kind of got seamlessly integrated into things, and it is part of what we're doing now. But it got hyped beyond belief, right? It was this the whole era of like, if you don't send your child to coding camp,
Yeah.
they'll die poor and homeless, right? And it's like number one job that's actually being replaced by AI is coding, right? It's the only thing that's going, right? That was foreseeable. So anyway, we've now decided to call this something else, and people are seduced by it because it's a talking Google. And if you do Claude, it's so obsequious. It's basically like a digital butler. But if you step back from it a minute and say, is this a transformative technology? Maybe. Is it going to replace everybody? No. Here's how it's going to damage people. If you're in college now and you are under a lot of pressure because you think that unless you take 5 classes and have 3 majors and major in things that are dead impressive, even though you're not into it, you'll die poor, alone, and homeless, then you will be under acute time pressures. And what you will do is you will use these technologies to cheat. I've seen it already, right? And when that happens, you normalize cheating, and then it becomes easy, and then you get good at it, and your other friends good at it. And then we end up in a situation whereby you've passed a class in international monetary relations, and that's fabulous. You've got an A on your transcript. And you go for an interview and you meet the private sector equivalent of me, and that guy turns around and goes, so tell me about the Latin American financial crisis and what lessons did it have for the East Asian crisis, part of your interview? You don't remember anything because you just made that shit up by pulling it out of an LLM, and you fail. And I've got this sneaking suspicion that the rise that we see now in graduates not getting jobs isn't the direct effects of that. It's the indirect effects of the people who are showing up not being very good. That's what I worry about with the skill effects of AI. If you're a scientist or a researcher, this is awesome. If you use this to cheat sheet your way through college, you're dumbifying yourself, and it's going to harm you in the long run.
So glad you brought that up. It's one thing I always tell my students. Yes, the degree might get you an opportunity at the job, but you actually have to do the job and keep it. So.
Yeah, totally. And not you have to be credible going in. They have to be excited about hiring you, which means that they have to believe that you know the stuff that's on the bit of paper. And I do worry about this technology really putting all that into question.
Yeah. So, Mark, as we wrap up here, I want folks to follow your work, follow your podcast. Where can folks get to know more about what you're doing and find your book and all that?
Well, I'm horrible at all this, and nobody looks at websites anymore. I do actually. I'm on Twitter. I post things out and never really engage. I'm on Blue Sky, same sort of thing. So I'm MK Blyth on both. On both of those, I've got a website, markblyth.com. You can find papers and everything that I'm up to there. That's generally, and podcasts. I mean, I show up on random podcasts. I've got 2. I have one called the Rhodes Center podcast, which I do when people visit the center that I'm running, which I'm only going to be running for the next year, then someone else takes over because it's been 7 years or so. So I don't know if that's going to continue. I used to do a news wrap up with my friend Carrie Nordland called Mark and Carrie, and that got taken down for about a year, but we're going to bring that back in the fall. So that's going to be called Mark and Carrie Shred the News, because I think that's all you can actually do at this point, and it's almost an anagram of read.
Well, good. Yeah, and also check out his books, Angrynomics, Austerity, and is inflation out now?
Yeah, inflation's out since May. Yeah, the fact that everyone asks me that tells me the brilliant job the publishers have done on marketing.
All right. He's Mark Blyth from Brown University. Thank you so much for coming on the Disinfo Detox.
It's been good, man.
All right. Thank you, Detoxers.